When John Mitchell, a 62-year-old farmer from rural Kansas, decided to write a letter to the President of the United States, he didn't expect a reply, much less a visit. But on that sweltering August morning, as he repaired the broken fence of the corral, a convoy of black SUVs turned down the dirt road leading to his property. No one said a word, until the door of one of the cars opened, and out stepped Donald Trump, with no visible security, walking straight toward John with an envelope in hand and a determined look. What happened in the next 45 minutes wasn't just an unlikely meeting between two worlds that rarely intersect. It was a clash of realities. A confrontation between the power that makes decisions in Washington and the sweat of those who bear the weight of them every day. And it all began with a handwritten letter, in shaky script, on paper stained with grease and dirt. A letter that didn't beg for handouts, but for dignity. That didn't seek attention, but respect. In this video, you'll hear the never-before-revealed details of that encounter. The words exchanged, the loaded silences, and the surprising twist that led the former president to reconsider, right then and there, his national agricultural plan. You're about to hear a story that's never been told. Until now. John Mitchell wasn't one to complain. The son of farmers, the grandson of pioneers, he'd learned early that the land responds better to effort than to lament. But that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table with a stack of overdue bills, he'd reached his limit. The price of fertilizer had doubled. Diesel tripled. The promised subsidies? Never came. And the new federal water regulations? A direct blow to his only irrigation source. It was there, between cold coffee and the creak of an old ceiling fan, that John grabbed a sheet of paper and began to write. "Mr. President," he started, bluntly, "this isn't a letter from an activist or a political enemy. It's a cry for help from someone who still believes you care about people like me." The letter was raw, honest, and above all human. John didn't mince words. He spoke of the humiliation of choosing between paying the tractor loan or buying his wife's medicine. He told how he'd had to sell 2 head of cattle just to keep the lights on. And he confessed, with shame, that for the first time in 40 years, he'd thought about giving up the farm. "I've read that letter. It moved me deeply. Not just because of its content, but because it was never meant to be read aloud. It was an intimate, honest, almost sacred outpouring." John sent it to the White House address with no expectations. He didn't even get a receipt confirmation. By all accounts, it was a forgotten letter. A message in a bottle. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Because when someone writes without thinking of applause or reward, what emerges is the truth. And truths like that, when they reach the right hands, have the power to move mountains. Or, in this case, to bring a president to a forgotten farm off the map. The sun was still rising when John heard the deep rumble of engines approaching down the dirt road. It was an unfamiliar sound in those parts, powerful, heavy, almost out of place in that landscape of dry pasture and rusted barns. He set down the feed bucket and walked slowly to the front gate, his gaze wary, like a man who'd seen too many promises turn to dust. Then the black SUVs appeared, like a procession of shadows over the gravel. No logos, no sirens. Just tinted windows and a silence so tense it seemed to press against his chest. When the door of the lead car opened, John almost doubted what he was seeing. Donald Trump, in a dark suit and without his usual noisy entourage, stepped out with an uncharacteristically serious expression. There was no announcement, no audience. It was just him, standing there under the harsh Kansas sun, holding an envelope. The letter. John's letter. Folded, creased by fingers that had clearly reread it more than once. The two men stood still for a few seconds, staring at each other. And in that silence, there was everything. Surprise, suspicion, the tension of opposing worlds colliding for the first time without filters or cameras. "You're John Mitchell?" Trump asked, breaking the silence with a voice more restrained than usual. "That's me," John replied, wiping his hands on his worn-out pants. Trump held out the envelope. "I read your letter. All of it." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that couldn't be explained. In that moment, John understood something unscripted was about to happen. This wasn't a political visit. It wasn't a campaign stunt. It was something rawer, more human. A meeting between the man who gives orders and the man who endures them. And while the rest of the country remained oblivious, in that forgotten corner of America, time seemed to stop. Because there, in that absolute silence, something big was about to begin. They walked side by side to the porch, where John offered a weathered wooden chair and 2 glasses of iced tea. Trump accepted without ceremony, sitting with an uncharacteristic stiffness, as if he were still trying to understand why, exactly, he'd decided to make this trip. For a few minutes, the conversation was civil. They talked about the heat, the drought plaguing the Midwest, until Trump pulled a folded paper from his inner jacket pocket, the copy of the letter. "You wrote that the government has abandoned small farmers. That we're good at speeches but absent when it comes to action. Do you really believe that's what we're doing to you?" he asked, his tone now more challenging. John didn't hesitate. He looked him straight in the eye. "With all due respect, Mr. President, I think it's worse. The government knows what's happening, but it chooses not to look." The words landed like a brick. Trump leaned back in his chair, visibly struck. It wasn't often someone spoke to him like that, especially not a simple man with no cameras, no audience. And maybe that's why he truly listened. It's not just about money. It's about value. You want us to feed America, but you won't even give us the basics to keep a cow alive. The incentives go to big corporations. The small farmers? We're treated like footnotes in some office report. Trump furrowed his brow. For the first time in a long while, someone was dismantling his rhetoric with brutal honesty. And it disarmed him. If I'd given up on the farm last year, no one would have noticed. No scandal. Just another property sold to some Canadian conglomerate. And you know what's worse? I would have disappeared quietly, like so many others already have. This wasn't a confrontation of shouting. It was a confrontation of truths. Of words that hurt because they were real. And there, in the middle of that field, surrounded by thin cows and cracked earth, the most powerful man in the country heard something no one had dared to tell him in a long time. That power only matters when it serves. And that empty promises, even in fertile soil, still don't grow what truly matters. Trump stayed silent for long seconds after John's words. He stared at the wooden porch floor as if searching for an answer where none was ready. For the first time in years, he had no comeback, no soundbite, no statistic to throw on the table. All he had was the raw reality of a man who wasn't asking for a favor, just justice. Then came the turning point. Not with fanfare, but with a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Trump pulled out his phone and right then and there, called his Secretary of Agriculture. "Put a report on my desk by tonight, names of every small farmer who lost subsidies in the last 2 years. And I want to know where that money was redirected. Personally." John said nothing. Just watched. He knew phone promises didn't change the world. But that gesture carried weight. Because for the first time, the man at the top was paying attention. Trump ended the call and looked at John with a half-smile. "You slapped me without raising a hand." John answered with the simplicity of a man who had no time left for games. "I just told you what's killing us from the inside." That conversation became more than politics. It was the moment power stepped off the stage and sat in the wooden chair of an ordinary citizen. And there, between silences and naked truths, the seed of change was planted. When Trump stood to leave, the air on the porch felt different. No longer tense with confrontation, but something more complex. A sense that something beyond control had already been set in motion. John walked him to the gate, where the SUVs still waited. Instead of a formal handshake, Trump turned to him and said, "John, I hope you prove me wrong." Those words weren't spoken with arrogance, but with a kind of genuine doubt. Something even he, it seemed, hadn't fully grasped until that moment. John nodded silently, gaze fixed on the horizon, but he knew this wasn't a promise. It was a starting point, the aftermath, a ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, small farmers began receiving direct communications from the White House about new policies to address the injustices John had exposed. It wasn't a perfect fix, but something in the system had begun to shift. What started as a private conversation between a farmer and a president became a rallying cry for those tired of waiting for real change. The impact wasn't limited to politics. News of Trump's visit spread rapidly, sparking an unexpected national debate about the true state of American agriculture. Suddenly, the future of small farms wasn't just a niche issue, it was front and center in political discourse. Without intending to, John became the face of a silent resistance. And without intending to, he planted an idea in the heart of government. Maybe it's time to listen before deciding. A political earthquake. The fallout was immediate. Agrarian leaders, both Republican and Democrat, pushed for deeper reforms. Trump's visit led to concrete promises that the issues John raised would be addressed. No more empty words. Now there was real pressure to correct decades-old inequalities. A new report on farm subsidies was announced, detailing fund redistribution and stricter oversight of corporate agribusiness. But not everyone was happy. Some GOP members, particularly those tied to big agribusiness, criticized Trump's shift, accusing him of abandoning traditional allies. The biggest impact, however, was in local elections. Across rural America, candidates who argued that Washington policies were out of touch gained momentum. John's story became a symbol, not just of resistance against a broken system, but against the growing disconnect between politics and the people. What began as one farmer's letter had quietly sparked a movement, redefining what it means to be American in the heartland. Trump, for his part, knew that visit to the farm had marked a turning point, and he was determined to make sure that encounter wouldn't be forgotten. But what he didn't expect was that John Mitchell, a simple man from Kansas, would hold more power than any election strategy. And so, John Mitchell's story became a milestone, not just for American agriculture, but for all of us. Sometimes, the greatest power comes from those we least expect. He didn't ask for sweeping changes, just demanded respect, and with one simple act, he sparked a movement that echoed across the country. Who would have thought a handwritten letter, in shaky script, could be the key to something so big? Maybe the real lesson here is that, in the end, it's the small actions, the honest conversations, and the genuine gestures that have the power to change the game. If this story inspired you, if you believe things can change when we dare to speak the truth, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear these words, and help us spread this message of transformation. Together, let's challenge the status quo and keep telling stories like this one, stories that prove change sometimes starts where we least expect it. Your action today could be the start of a revolution tomorrow. So let's make this idea grow. See you in the next video.